People call me the Nickinator. It's a combination of my name, Nicole, and the Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator character. Folks literally out here comparing me to a cyborg assassin. But I would ask you, what has ever caused you to change? What are the things that shift your perspective? Because for me, I needed my mother to die. And about half the time, people are mortified that I would say such a thing. But I love my mama. So I always explain that there are things like getting cancer, losing everything you have, or suddenly finding out that your mother has passed away that has the propensity to build empathy muscle. You see, I was standing in the lobby of a trauma center, and besides the few random people who were walking around, it was eerily quiet. And this was odd considering I was expecting a flurry of activity. I was expecting chaos, wailing cries, rolling gurneys, doctors screaming medical jargon. But instead, I was practically surrounded by silence as I waited for news. And that's when a lovely older woman, a hospital chaplain, I'm sure, walked up to me and with the kindest eyes and the sweetest voice, she said, "Gertrude Price was your mother?" Was, past tense. Listen, you probably have never even heard of her, but Gertrude Price was my mother. And shortly after she died, we had to find a larger church for her funeral because thousands of people planned to show up. They weren't coming because of anything she'd accomplished. They weren't coming because of any accolades associated with her name. They were coming because of how she touched them. Many of those thousands described her using words like nice and kind as they recounted story after story of her helping them when they were in trouble, of her feeding them when they were hungry, of her restoring relationships. A couple of people even said she paid their rent. I wish I were more like her, but the truth is I'm just not that nice. It was my mom's death that was the catalyst for me to even begin thinking about what do we mean when we use words like empathy? And if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that it means something different from being nice. It is something more than being kind. My mother's life of service is a beautiful example of compassionate empathy on display. She understood what people needed, and she was motivated to act on that need. But compassionate empathy does not always lead to kind acts of service. Sometimes empathy can be used as a weapon. And I know this because I grew up directly across the street from a pimp. His name was Brad. You'd think a pimp would have a nickname like Slim or Ice, Slickback, something. This dude's name was just Brad. And Brad is more than 70 years old now, but he is still working women, still slapping women around, still playing on their fears and needs like some kind of virtuoso of emotional manipulation. People are shocked that I would say Brad is empathetic because his methods are so harsh. But what you cannot deny is that Brad understands women. He understands the people he manages, and he understands their customers too. And this unsettling blend of insight and manipulation illustrates that when empathy is stripped of compassion, it can be deeply harmful. I know many nice, well-meaning, deep, feeling people who Brad runs circles around in terms of applying empathy. He knows chapter and verse how to read people and how to read situations. He's one of the best examples I've ever seen that you can be empathetic and still be manipulative. After all, it was my own mama who said, "Baby, even devils know scripture." In those moments, she was warning me. She was clarifying for me that simply knowing about or even using virtuous concepts like empathy doesn't make anyone inherently good or moral. My mother, in all her wisdom, never lived to see 70 years old. Unlike Brad, she had her life cut short by a drunk driver who was also high, speeding on a side street in a stolen car when he ran a red light and smashed into her. Afterwards, he jumps out of that car, sees her on the ground in incredible pain, and instead of helping, he took off running. His name is Jonathan. And the day he killed my mother, he was only 22 years old. But he was no stranger to trouble. So much so, the prosecution was seeking the maximum sentence, which was far more years than he'd been alive at that point. And everyone who knew my mother wanted the same thing. She had built a legacy and we were prepared to defend it. So why then didn't I advocate for the maximum sentence? We've established it's not because I was that nice. It was not benevolence. As we sat in that courtroom advocating for justice, there were some things that became patently clear. When I make good choices, it's because I've had good options. When I've made bad choices, I've had a support system that could bail me out. Not Jonathan. His defense illuminated decades of impossible situations, leading to one poor choice after another. But I didn't care. My levels of effective empathy couldn't have been lower. My grief was too great to connect with him in any emotional way. But for everything I don't understand about emotions, I make up for it in my understanding of hypocrisy. And empathy cannot sit on a bed of hypocrisy. My mother would have extended empathy in its most challenging form, connecting with someone completely her opposite, radically empathizing possibly with her own murderer. As I sat on the stand, I was torn. I was crying so hard my words could barely be understood, because is it possible to honor the life of someone like Sister Gertrude Price and not even mention the words compassionate empathy? Is it possible to seek justice, consider everybody involved, and avoid harming those people who have already been harmed enough? I don't know. But on the top of my dome, and with great clarity, I knew that nothing I said or did for or against Jonathan was going to help bring my mother back. Some harm is irreparable. My entire life, I had watched my mother's compassionate empathy on display, but I didn't gain much of it at all until after she died. You don't learn compassionate empathy in a classroom. At least people like me don't. We learn compassionate empathy by having our worlds shattered. But I am convinced that it was not compassionate empathy that was needed that day to get us to a more just resolution. It was cognitive empathy that was needed. And I did not learn cognitive empathy by watching Saints. I learned cognitive empathy in the streets from watching Pimps. And this is a disturbing thought, but it reveals a profound truth, and that is that empathy in its rawest form is neutral. It is like a hammer that you can use to build or to break. That the hands that hold it are the ones that determine whether or not its use is good or bad. And Brad's more cognitive form of tactical empathy is used by parents, but it's also used by preachers. It's used by hostage negotiators, politicians, shampoo peddlers even. And it is taking our knowledge of what people think, feel, and believe and using that information to get them to do what we want. I have been trying to get people to embrace empathy as a tactic for years. And I used to be terrible at my job because I'd mentioned Brad. Whenever I would advocate for using empathy as a tactic, I'd offer up Brad as an example and show how persuasive he was, how motivating he was. Abusive, but persuasive and motivating. And people would ask me questions, but those questions wouldn't be about Brad. Or the questions would not be about their children, rather, their spouse or partner, their neighbor, their coworkers who are late. It wouldn't be about any of those people. They would say things like, Nicole, what about Brad? Doesn't he deserve your empathy? Brad? Listen, while I am vehemently opposed to having hug fest with tenured pimps, I am coming to love this question. Because it proves my point rather than contradicting it. Even in the question, it is clear we got work to do. It is not cognitive empathy that would cause us to think that we feel what Brad feels. It is projecting our own kindness or niceness onto Brad that would cause us to think that he's any different from everything he's shown us with a half a century of busted lips, slapped faces, and dislodged teeth. When I say this, people say, Nicole, you sure are judgmental, girl. And I say, it ain't judgment, baby, it's discernment. You see, my mother used to cook a lot. And after Brad had beaten everyone up, his mama and the ladies, just so we're clear, the man used to beat up his own mother. My mother would send me over there with plates of food for them. That whole book of Isaiah, feed those who are hungry and help those in trouble, she had that down. But would you send your teenage daughter over to the pimp's house for any reason? I needed discernment. When I would go on those neighborly errands, I was afraid. In my young mind, I knew Brad to be incredibly powerful and dangerous. And my understanding of him has only grown over time. I empathize, Brad. I understand him just fine. I overstand him actually to be dangerous. I have not characterized him as a monster. I ain't ever even called him the devil. I understand Brad to be human and tenacious. I understand what he and I have in common because I too have the capacity for grave human error. That's the empathy paradox. It elevates everyone's humanity without letting anyone off the hook. It's the reason why I name Brad's abusive behaviors. There's no reason to ascribe positive characteristics to negative behavior. Empathy and accountability are allies, they are not enemies. It's the reason why I also name everything Jonathan did that fateful day. The drinking and driving high in a stolen car, leaving my mother in the street for dead, because it's factual. And Jonathan did not wake up that morning intending to kill my mother. And we could all stand to ditch our hypocrisy. Lean into cognitive empathy with me. We can do it right now. Have any of you ever had one too many drinks and then gotten behind the wheel of a car? Perhaps you don't drink. Have you ever taken your eyes off the road for any reason or been distracted for any reason, perhaps texting while driving? Because if so, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is very clear in their reports. When we text and drive, we put people in danger because when we text and drive, we take our eyes off the road for an average of 5 seconds, allowing us to travel the distance of a football field, making texting while driving 6 times more dangerous than drinking while driving. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I ain't trying to normalize Jonathan's behavior. I'm not even asking you to walk a mile in his shoes. But I am asking us to look at our own shoes and ask ourselves, where have they been? Where have they been? I don't think that we should run everything through a what would Brad do filter. But when we diversify our empathy toolboxes to include cognitive empathy like Brad, we learn to read the room. We listen better. We pay attention, not because we want people to walk the streets for us for money, but because we understand that we are smarter, actually, when we know what people think, feel, and believe. People are using cognitive empathy for bad. Why can't we use it for good? When people say to me, Nicole, I don't know if empathy is necessary for us to be able to fight some of the world's most nefarious problems. I think we have too much. It is my hope that when we feel that nastiness in our gut, when we're bombing children halfway across the globe, that we will pay attention to it. That we will stop ignoring the sweating of our palms when we see people being bullied. That thing in our throat when children are scurrying away from a mass shooter in a school, that we stop numbing. Because that's what's necessary in order to win the empathy battle. Because people like Brad, they understand it. They understand it. And when people say to me, Nicole, empathy is a weakness, or how are we going to hold these people accountable? I just think about Brad. What about him would make anyone think that he's weak? Doesn't look like weakness to me. It looks like empathy without a shred of compassion. When I consider my mother, I recognize that I used to judge her harshly for sending me over to Brad's house. But what if she knew that empathy required courage? What if she knew that in order to be courageous, you have to learn how to do it scared? And what if my mother was building my competence to show up in courageous ways, radically empathetic ways? It is hard for you to be empathetic when you don't know the story. It's impossible, actually. And I get it. I might be the worst person in the world to talk to anybody about empathy, because some of y'all might have receipts. For almost 2 decades, people compared me to the Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator character. And I don't like to say it, but legitimately so. But my mother's death changed me. My unlikely encounter with her murderer changed me. It helped me to see that any one of us can be the spark of a revolution, an empathy revolution. The challenge is our lessons might not only come from the likes of Sister Gertrude Price's. Our lessons might also come from people like neighborhood pimps. Thank you.